So can I get the slide, please? Thank you. Just one brief word ahead of my talk in order to observe my time frame and not to get lost in the mazy hinterland of normative hair splitting that these discussions usually trigger. I put most of what I'm going to tell you on those slides. What is that? Oh. That me? Oh. Okay. Just 4 brief scenarios on the factual background. Here's the first one: pharmacological enhancement of cognitive, emotional, or volitional capacities of the brain or the mind, as the case might be. Here is the situation in Germany. 1 out of 5 students takes pills, brain doping booming at German university. But that's nothing new, and it's not very remarkable, at least not from a legal point of view. So this is my second scenario: enhancement through brain stimulation. And here's an article on modulating neuronal activity produces specific and long-lasting changes in numerical competence. This is underlined right here. They say they could improve numerical competence. This is my third scenario: enhancement by manipulating memory. Selective erasure of a fear memory. So you see that enhancing memory, it does not necessarily mean to augment your capacity to remember things, but in certain contexts to improve the capacity to forget things. That might work in humans as well, preventing the return of fear in humans using reconsolidation update mechanisms. Here they say, the authors say, that might open a window of opportunity to rewrite emotional memory. And here's my fourth scenario. This is a short clip of a video that I'm sure all of you know. It's the type of iconic video that Karl Dieseroth put on the internet some 15 years ago. And yeah, it's only a short clip.
This program is brought to you by Stanford University.
So I'm in 2 departments which you don't often see described together or mentioned in the same breath. You can see it here: bioengineering and structures. In an illustration of this, I want to show you a mouse. You might know that the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body and controls movement toward and attention toward the left side of the world. So we put in this optical fiber and we drove right motor cortex, right part of the brain that controls complex movements, thinking maybe we could get an animal to want to turn to the left. And this movie is shown here. You can't even see the fiber optic, but when the light stimulation goes on, you'll see a little blue light reflectance from the head of the animal, so you'll know when the light goes on. And we turn it off down at the bottom. He stops. So this is a little scary, right? I don't want to sweep that aspect under the rug either. In fact, I'm going to come back and talk about it at the end. From the clinical standpoint, this is wonderful because this shows we can use light to help modulate behavior.
So this comment by Karl Dieseroth is the reasons why I put this short clip in here. It shows that we can use light to modulate behavior. And not to forget, of course, mind wars and DARPA, US Defense Advanced Research Project Agency. They are, of course, interested in manipulating soldiers' minds. Three basic normative questions pose themselves. Do we as a society endorse these developments? What are the pros and cons of this question? What role, if any, should the law play in regulating these developments? Now, a distinction between external and internal enhancement. Roughly, this means the following. Humans have always attempted to improve their mental capacities by improving certain environmental conditions, from the inventions of script and print to the psychological optimization of learning conditions and the development of ever more powerful cognitive tools, such as computers, for instance. This I shall call external enhancement. From these, I distinguish enhancing biotechnological interventions that aim directly at the embodied person herself. These I term internal enhancements, and in what follows, I shall consider the latter only. Two hints on that. The main reason for our intuitive distinction between interventions in our cognitive environment and in our brain is our self-image, as it has emerged in the course of evolution. According to it, the spatial boundary of our I is our body's outer mantle. Functional means of cognition beyond our skin are instruments, those embodied inside our part ourselves. Normatively, however, and I want to stress this point, this boundary is permeable. As a criterion for the permissibility or impermissibility of an enhancement, it is weak, even misleading. If we find the external enhancement of a mental property M by a factor X not only acceptable, but laudable, as we certainly do with many M's, then it seems rather odd to judge an internal enhancement of the same M by the same factor X condemnable ab initio, as some people are inclined to do. Now, if we talk about the limits to individual self-determination in terms of enhancing oneself, we have to draw basic normative distinctions. I would distinguish enhancement of one's own mental features and, of course, enhancement of mental features of others without their consent, because with their consent, it would be a type of enhancement of one's own mental features. And here I would distinguish one-party cases where a person applies enhancing method only on herself, and two-party cases where a person uses an intermediary, normally a physician. And enhancement of others, we would distinguish between persons that are to be enhanced that can give valid consent. Think of enhanceable prison inmates that are intent to, become better persons, if there's such a thing as moral enhancement. And the person to be enhanced is unable to give valid consent, for instance, children. For the significantly different normative problem that ensue from these four types, the distinction between law and ethics is important. Now, I want to take a look at the problem of enhancing one's own mental features. There is a row of basic objections, side effects, of course, safety, including questions of the limits of informed consent, that is, of the risks that can be justified by simply giving consent. Problems, second, of autonomy, authenticity, personal identity. Could they be compromised? Third, corruption, perhaps even social invalidation of the desired goals themselves, that is, of the artificially enhanced capacity. Corruption of human nature, of human dignity, expanding medicalization of heretofore normal variants of mental property. As soon as you can enhance properties, there is a certain risk that people who do not want to do so are considered to be, in a way, not up to the point where they could be, in some sense, to be not healthy. Misuse for the external control of human beings, misuse for military purposes, and of course, problems of social justice. I only want to take a brief look at these two. Corruption of the aspired goals. The idea might be illustrated by an analogy to doping in sports. Many would contend that doping is reprehensible, not only as a form of fraud, but also because it devalues the athletic achievements that crucially depend on it. Such concerns might well apply to some cognitive, for instance, scientific or artistic enhancements too. Think of the victory of the chess computer Deep Blue 25 years ago against the then world champion Garry Kasparov. Who would seriously have admired the intellectual performance of the machine? Probably no one. Thus, to the extent that human mental performances would have to be ascribed solely to a technical, and that is to say, purchasable source, say a computer-brain interface, such a process of devaluation might ensue as a common social phenomenon. Discrediting the goals, in dealing with this question, we would have the following distinction. On the other hand, there are mental capacities whose even purely artificial origin would not compromise them or their possessors in the least. Imagine the, at least to me, dreadful task of learning Chinese, simply made unnecessary by an implanted brain device, which will never come, of course. That's a thought experiment. Hence, I propose to distinguish between two types of mental achievements, which, for want of better ideas, I call output-oriented versus engagement-oriented. Meaning, capacities that we value only instrumentally, that is, simply for having them at our disposal. And that means that the arduous way to certain achievement is an integral part of our esteem for it, such as the ability to run 100 meters dash in 9.5 seconds. There are quite a few animals who can do it even faster if we wouldn't admire that. Corruption, my next point, of human nature, of human dignity. This is a quotation. Human dignity, which among others designates the non-disposability, the non-makeability, so to say, of human beings, is violated, for instance, by interspecies hybridization. In general, Article 1 of our Constitution, the German Grundgesetz, must prove itself as the last and insurmountable barrier against any systematically optimizing intervention in the human species. It's one of my colleagues who is a leading figure in German constitutional law. This seems to encompass certain types of mental enhancements too. For instance, brain-computer interfaces that would generate a kind of hybrid brain, half human, half machine, whose capacities would clearly transcend the mental limits of our species. If that amounted to a violation of human dignity, a legal prohibition backed by sanctions of the criminal law would certainly be called for. But is that plausible? The creation of a consciousness, an I, so to speak, qua biological crossing of a human and a primate brain would appear far more despicable than the integration of a computer chip into a human brain, allowing for mental capabilities beyond species boundaries. Now, why this? Do machines have a higher dignity than our genetically next of kin? Well, hardly. In fact, what really offends us doesn't seem to be the idea of hybridization at all, but the fact that the combination of a human and a primate brain would create a being with properties below our species boundaries, whereas the man-machine combination would bring about a being with capacities above those limits, which by far doesn't seem as bad as the other option. Prohibition of optimization, again, a thought experiment that was brought into the world in a very different context by Richard Dawkins, who is the bad guy, I understand, from England. Imagine a woman with her mother standing at her left side, and at her mother's left side standing her mother's mother, etc. Think of this chain as 200 kilometers long, then we have at its end a monkey. Imagine furthermore that 6 million years ago, the monkeys in a lucid interval had determined to stand sentinel over the biological limits of their mental property, and to warrant a strict prohibition of species optimization. Had they then succeeded in doing so, we would not be around. This is not meant as a fairly shallow joke. A prohibition of optimization that warrants eternal protection for the biological limits of our species, as the German Constitution does for its Article 1, and thus for human dignity, would finally turn against evolution itself. This looks like a somewhat bizarre implication. Article 1 of our Constitution, that's what I say, should not be interpreted this way. A better insight to be drawn from Dawkins' thought experiment. This thought experiment, however, not only discredits the false, namely dignity-based view on our species limitations, it also points to a more appropriate one. After all, it took 6 million years for evolution to go all the way from our primate ancestors to us current humans. This long time has provided for the means and opportunities of countless minuscule adaptive processes. And in some, they may well have ensured that the evolution from primates to humans could take place without major biological or social catastrophe. The idea that in the future a comparable leap could perhaps be compressed into a period of 100 years makes one feel a bit dizzy, me at any rate. Why that? Human brain tissue is the most complex type, as far as we know, of matter in the universe. So its balanced equilibrium, that is not to say its optimal evolutionary state. I would never claim that. The result of millions of years of evolution might be substantially distorted by far-reaching and abrupt technical alteration. Hence, the risk of grave biological, psychological, and social disruptions by deep and mind-altering interventions into the brain cannot be dismissed out of hand. So it's not dignity, but safety what's really at stake. Safety for a human good that as yet enjoys legal protection in particular aspects only, but not as an integrative whole. I provisionally want to call it mental integrity. and we'll return to it in a moment. So tasks for the law would be four principal types. Protection of people with implanted brain-computer interfaces against external interventions without consent by others. Here you have a paper on that, Attacking Human Implants, the new generation of cybercrime, or somewhat more bluntly, hacking the brain. Second, regulation of a growing market of commercialized neuroenhancement devices, such as brain stimulators. Here's a paper on that. The regulation of cognitive enhancement devices, extending the medical model, which sounds reasonable. Third, protection of people against involuntary enhancement. Now, interventions without consent, aren't they prohibited anyway? Well, no. In fact, under certain circumstances, not at all. Involuntary mental enhancements, even with far-reaching and lasting psychic consequences, realized, however, through procedures of only minimal physical invasiveness, are not covered by protective legal norms at all. For instance, brain stimulation through TMS. This is so because the law of criminal assault presupposes, as it were, a threshold of triviality. Below this threshold, bodily effects of only minimal dimensions, though formally unlawful, do not constitute the crime of battery. And even if a specific mentally enhancing intervention in its physical aspects is covered by a statute of assault, it would appear inappropriate to penalize it for its physical effects if the only reason why it is deemed punishable at all are its mental effects. Here's an example. Consider Manager M, presently engaged in tough and hostile negotiations with his opponent O over an unfriendly company takeover. During a break, M advises his secretary to spray large amounts of the scentless neuropeptide oxytocin in the air of the conference room. After the coffee break, the substance alters O's mood and behavior considerably. Now he finds Mr. M likable, trusts him entirely, and finally signs the contract. Now, if that is really scientifically valid, I have my own doubts, but it may not be just science fiction, and it may become, within the reach of possibility. According to at least German criminal law, our Mr. M would go unpunished. He neither committed the crime of battery, nor an unlawful coercion, nor a fraud. Other possible offenses on his part are not in sight. Other character traits might be enhanceable too. Love. Neuroscience reveals all. Well, it was published in Nature, not, just somewhere. Or, in some contexts, this would be quite reasonable, even if done without consent. Parental love built some ethical consideration. The author thinks that might become possible. I am no expert on that. But as I said, it might be reasonable, even without consent. But would it be justifiable? Of course not. It would violate the autonomy of the thus enhanced person. For hundreds of years, now this is my statement on that, criminal law has been protecting the sanctity of the home, that is, prohibited the breach of domestic peace. Considering the current dynamic progress of the neurotechnology, isn't it time to also protect the sanctity of the mind? I think it is. The legal good to be protected thereby is what I want to call mental self-determination. I believe that this flags a good that should find its way into the catalogs of constitutional as well as international human rights. the structure and content of such a right. It encompasses, of course, a negative, that is defensive, right, against all interventions into the mental sphere of others that A, act directly upon these others' brains, and B, are sufficiently weighty, and C, are not authorized by a valid consent. And it also encompasses a positive right, a far-reaching legal entitlement to self-modulate one's own mental state, one's brain. This positive right certainly has some principal limits too. Where exactly these should be drawn is currently quite unclear. The negative, defensive aspect of that right, however, needs and deserves comprehensive protection already now. Several conventions on human rights contain provisions that explicitly protect a right to freedom of thought. For instance, Article 18, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which we have heard. However, virtually no state and no national legal order has taken that right seriously so far, simply because there has always been a tacit conviction that this was unnecessary. As the US Supreme Court stated in a verdict of 1942, freedom to think is absolute of its own nature. The most tyrannical government is powerless to control the inward working of the human mind. And I would say this is simply not true anymore. The main problem, of course, of this negative defensive right is the systematic demarcation of illicit interventions from entirely mundane and socially adequate forms of intervening into others' brains and minds. We always do. I, right now, intervene into your minds. Each act of communication, every good argument, every talk at a conference, every flirt that inspirits someone else's mood, etc., alters other people's minds and hence brain state. The crucial criterion, to cut a long discussion very short, of the set demarcation is not the psychic weight of such an intervention or the severity of mental harm it causes, for even most detrimental and consciously inflicted psychic harms can be outrightly permitted, at least legally, maybe not morally. Think of withdrawing one's love, breaking up a marriage, thereby causing severe depression, even suicidal disposition, all perfectly legal. Rather, the criterion I'm looking for is the fact that an intervention was performed directly upon the target person's brain. That is, not by way of utilizing public space, and second, not mediated by the sensory organs or the perceptual means of the addressee. In such cases, the other's mental control capacities are circumvented and functionally undermined by directly intervening into their brains. The psychic consequences of such a direct kind of creeping in intervention must, of course, exceed trivial effects. However, if they do, the physiological trivial brain modification on which they rest amounts to a serious violation of the target's mental self-determination. And my last task for the law, enforcing certain limits of individual self-position in order to protect people against themselves, which is, of course, a huge problem, and protect society against profoundly perturbing effects. I will cut that very short. Are there at present legitimate reasons to legally enforce certain limits to mental self-enhancements of autonomous persons? I think not. In view of the current state of neurotechnical means, enforceable legal prohibitions are not just, at least not in liberal legal order. I'm talking about self-enhancement. There is, however, a duty for the state to monitor future developments, especially with regard to the protection of legitimate societal interests, such as standards of distributive justice, that might be distorted by freely purchasable but very costly means of cognitive enhancement. The criminal law, however, is poorly qualified for regulating such concerns of protecting public good, however, not principally illegitimate for that purpose. And here's my finis. The threshold for legal interferences with a person's positive right to mental self-determination should be high. First, one should not overlook that a widespread and affordable practice of cognitive or emotional enhancement would probably also have a variety of positive social effects. Second, a liberal legal order should not react too hastily to popular worries about a moderate neurotechnical evolution of humankind. There is no such thing as an in-principle right to the preservation of a given form of social life. Finally, it is mainly, I think, up to us and not to the law to accommodate the emerging neurotechnical possibilities in a humane and fruitful way. Thank you.